going to switch to English and start our program because I'm very, very proud to introduce you live from Canada, where everything is quiet now because everybody's asleep at the moment. I think it was just after midnight there. I present you Dr. Tracey Burns, and Tracey is a senior analyst in OECD Center for Educational Research and Innovation. She has a portfolio of projects, including Trend-Shaping Education, the 21st Century Children, and Innovative Teaching for Effective Learning. And she will give today an overview of the challenges of the COVID-19 pandemic brings along worldwide. And more specifically, she will focus on build resilience and adaptability for the future. Before I give the floor to Tracey, I will explain the way we will organize some interaction. It's not possible to ask questions during the presentation. We are with more than 400 participants, now 300 in the here in this plenary session. So I invite all participants to use the chat to share your questions, reflections, comments. You can do that in English or in Dutch. That's no problem if you do that in Dutch. I will read the comments and questions afterwards. I will give Tracey 3 up to 5 questions after her talk. So Tracey, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jeroen, and thank you so much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to join you all the way from the west coast of Canada, where it is quite dark, but still exciting to be here. And I'm practicing my Dutch, so I'm getting better every minute. I'm going to try to share my screen and hope that this works to be able to talk to you while I can also see what I'm doing. And hopefully that worked for you guys. I can just start by saying, as Jeroen said, the topic is really based on reflections around responding to COVID and our observations at the OECD, and thinking about what countries are doing. And of course, what we've noticed is that, you know, as we begin 2021, education authorities are responding essentially on 2 time scales at the same time. The first is the current public health challenges for schools, which we already heard you talking about this morning. And the second is a midterm strategy for the next 18 to 24 months. And I should say that a lot of the remarks I'll make this morning are based on a trend-shaping education spotlight that we put out in April last year, actually, as a very first response to the school lockdowns and school closures in the spring of 2020. And reading it again, almost 9-10 months later, it has stood the test of time, which is good and exciting, but also a bit troubling. So if you'd like to read it, it's available on our website, or we can send it to you. It's just a short brief, very around 10 pages. So thinking about sort of where we are now, I don't need to tell you it's ongoing disruption. We've already heard Rens talk about the Netherlands this morning. Effectively, for those where schools are open, Canada as an example, the big preoccupation is ensuring the safety and hygiene, of course, of the schools, and to be able to keep them open. And this, I wanted to just flag, is both the actual safety and hygiene, as well as the perceived safety. Because in order for the system to function, the teachers need to feel that they can safely go to work. The students need to feel that they are safe in classrooms in order to learn. And parents need to trust that they can send their children to school. So both of these elements, the actual safety and perceived safety, are incredibly important. And that's something that we notice that countries are working very hard on both. They feed each other, obviously, but they're separable and they're both important. The second thing, of course, is really trying to understand what's gone on thus far. It has now turned from a sprint into a marathon 10 months in, assessing progress of students, mitigating the impact of any learning losses, and ensuring learning continuity in systems where there are still school closures. And we imagine that there will be rolling school closures for other systems. And this is incredibly disruptive. And there's really a question of, well, how do we actually maintain how do we get through this in the best possible way? And the other major thing is really just ensuring well-being, ensuring the well-being of both students and teachers. This is a really disruptive time. As I've said, it's very stressful, even though it doesn't necessarily feel like that. It does have an impact, and research from other crises and other both sort of pandemic work and also work from sort of large forest fires that disrupted schools or other events show that there can be long-standing impacts if the well-being isn't carefully thought through. So all of this, of course, and this is part of your discussion today, all of this is really about sort of continuity of learning. And when we look across the OECD, we've seen an enormous amount of energy and sort of innovation happening. I mean, to ensure access, in a shift to digital learning, to really make sure that people can take part. We've seen really innovative work on national broadband plans. We've seen also if in countries like New Zealand, for example, or Mexico, where they didn't necessarily have the reach of the broadband, they've put classes out on TV and radio, just very innovative ways of just trying to get the instruction out there. A huge push to get devices to students, particularly those from more disadvantaged families and from more disadvantaged schools, and really building up the ICT infrastructure, which, despite all of our lovely statistics, which seemed like we mostly had access. We've been saying that for years, that we've got access. We are working on the skills piece. It turns out that when you go 100% online learning and you've got 4 siblings and 1 phone, that's not enough, actually. So also a lot of work has gone into that, and also rethinking some of the statistics that we were keeping. The goal, of course, is developing skills through curriculum development, a lot of interventions, and what we're seeing now in schools that are open. So, for example, where I am now in Vancouver, really a push towards hybrid learning. So a certain number of students in the class, but not as many as normal because they want fewer people and more space. And that means that the teacher is actually then working with students online at the same time. And this is incredibly difficult as a pedagogical element. And just in terms of managing people and managing demands, it's actually pretty unprecedented for a lot of the teachers that aren't specifically taught in this. And so there's a lot of a steep learning curve, not just for the students, but also the teachers. And we're seeing, of course, also a lot of extracurricular activities in areas where it's possible and there isn't lockdown. And as I said, the goal is to continue learning, and this is the short-term goal. And the obvious piece there is, well, then how do we build capacity for the system to do that, especially when there's not really any time? And so there's 2 elements, the teacher education piece and the partnerships, and I'll just very briefly give a couple of examples of what we're seeing. The first, of course, is the digital. That's the big story from this. And this is TALIS data from 2018. So this is old data. In fact, it's pre-COVID. ICT skills for teaching is the second most reported need of teachers saying they have a high need for professional development. ICT skills for teaching is the second highest. And one thing I want to underline here is that it was the second highest in 2008. It was the second highest in 2013, and it was the second highest in 2018. That's despite the fact that this is actually whether or not teachers report having it in their professional development. And in fact, they do. They report that on the whole, it's one of the ones that they have more often. So there's a question here around what is this data telling us? And one question is sort of whether the training is fit for purpose. But another question or another element is that we have to acknowledge that technology changes so quickly that even if a teacher is taught, with the cutting edge skills and it's a great training program, within even 2, 3, certainly 5 years, a lot of what they've taught that is outdated. And so there's this really quick speed of always continuing to be on the cutting edge, which I think is actually really specific to digital skills and digital pedagogical skills. And we need to think through how and what we expect students and teachers to actually master. I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. In addition, of course, we're really seeing the change of roles. I've talked already about well-being. Emotional well-being of students is something that we asked TALIS. We don't have data on this, so we just have a policy questionnaire of just 26 countries, ministries answering this. Just asking, do you cover emotional well-being of students in your initial teacher education and continuing professional development? And over 50% said yes, it was required, or, you know, it's very present. But a fair number said it was either covered only in some programs or not widely available. And that we've seen now, of course, this is, you know, this is something which we expect these statistics to change. But there's a real question about, well, how well are teachers being prepared for these new roles? Digital skills, I think that's pretty well covered, but the last piece on the right there is assessing online risks to students. And here we have the lowest reported coverage. We've actually got over 10% saying that it's not widely available. And this for us is really a disconnect with the policy language, which is very much concerned around cyberbullying and abusive, you know, a possible abuse online, security of private data, etc. And so for us, it's really a clear disconnect between what we expect teachers to deliver and what we're concerned about when we think about protecting the safety of children and what they're actually getting in their professional development. So thinking through, well, how do we actually think we are going to solve this? One question, of course, is, well, who would we actually expect teachers to partner with? And we're seeing, you know, a lot of partnerships with parents, mental health professionals to some extent, medical professionals less. But the digital expert piece is really the piece I wanted to highlight in the sense that it's very infrequent. This is on a ministry level, by the way, so there might be a lot of local initiatives, but when you look nationally or regionally or by system, it's not widely present. And this I want to connect to the part about technological change and the speed of technological change, because I actually think we can't reasonably expect headmasters or teachers to be up to date every single minute. And so we're going to increasingly need to partner with the digital experts just to have that cutting edge knowledge and to be relevant for protecting student data, for example, protecting against any kind of system threats. And that's something that it would be, you know, we're looking forward to having a bigger conversation about and really trying to think that through in the next sort of 2 to 5 years, because it's becoming increasingly urgent. So when we think through, you know, okay, that's what we're thinking about. Now, a lot of these issues are specific to COVID, but they're also not new. And so this is sort of a question around, well, how do we want to be strategic? How do we want to make sure we are not in a situation where this could happen again? Not from the pandemic point of view, you know, public health is not, education does not control public health, obviously, but in terms of education's preparedness. So thinking about what do the next 12 to 18 months bring? One possibility is, of course, that we're just all tired, and we are all tired. And so one possibility is sort of just a return to normal. But we would argue that that's actually a bit of a missed opportunity. Firstly, because we believe that, and we have seen, it's very clear, that in the sort of last 10 months, we've seen an enormous amount of innovation, just a huge amount of efforts from students, schools, teachers, headmasters, ministries, educational authorities. People have been really just, you know, finding a way to make it happen as best they can. And this is something we definitely don't want to lose. We want to learn what worked, we want to learn what didn't work, and we want to take forward the best of what has been seen. And we want to be able, of course, to scale it up, because often it's quite local. And the other question, or the other opportunity that really springs to mind, is really thinking about, well, you know, can we reimagine accountability? We've talked about the sort of ways that teachers' roles are changing. They're expected to not just do academic teaching, but they're expected to take care of emotional well-being, increasingly physical health, and a bit of hygiene in the class. And so one question is, well, are our sort of test cultures, are our teacher evaluation cultures really in line with those expectations? Do we have a way of you know, running accountability in our system, which is moving and changing and adapting with the kinds of goals we have for education? The good news here is, you know, the vast majorities, this is again TALIS data, I think that the next round will see some big changes. The vast majority of teachers have a positive attitude towards change innovation. I would expect that these numbers would go up in the next round, just because we've seen so much change in innovation. I've highlighted the Flemish community there, but the Netherlands is just 2 over. And so you've got, you know, a really positive reflection on schools being open to change and teachers finding ways to solve problems. And as I said, we would expect those data to go up because we've seen it everywhere, a really amazing efforts. But of course, the other thing is that a lot of and many elements of our systems don't always work together, and there are inherent tensions between our policy and our intentions for learning. So one obvious tension is the tension between innovation and sort of thinking about how we want to improve the system, and risk avoidance, which is about minimizing risk and error, which is very much about part of the accountability paradigm. You want to make sure you're getting your money's worth, and you want to make sure that you're getting the best possible teaching and learning for the system. But of course, the question is always, what is the balance between the two, and what is the cost of inaction and not actually trying something new? And here we have the big piece, or the big, you know, elephant in the room, which is accountability, which of course its goal is to improve the system. That's the intention. It's very clear. The downside is, and this is the tension part, that when you think about innovation, you have to be prepared to fail. You have to be able to try a bunch of new things, and if you fail, you learn from it. But in many systems, the accountability does not actually allow for that. So we ask for creative teachers, for example. This is in every policy document. But then teachers report, and their accountability systems and evaluation systems are quite clear that failing is not really an option. And so there's no answer to, there's no magic solution, but it's important to keep this in mind, because you actually need to really think through and understand, when you ask for creativity, you can't do it at the same time as you ask for no mistakes. And so this is one of the conversations we would expect education systems to be having in the next 12 to 24 months, when they think about reimagining and think about pushing the boundaries, is, well, let's make it realistic. Let's ask what we can ask for in the context of our systems. And if we want more innovation, we might need to think about how we want to shape the accountability piece. Another couple of points I wanted to stress, another couple of potential opportunities, and I'm really interested in your comments and your discussion and how well that you think this relates to the Flemish and Dutch contexts, is really thinking through, you know, what did we learn from school closures and from the first waves of COVID, is, of course, we really learned about the power of the physical world, right? So a lot of our talk, a lot of our policies, a lot of our planning for the future of education has really focused on the digital, and for very good reason. I mean, the digital is sort of the way of the future. But one thing that was really brought home was just how important schools are, not just as places of learning, but as part of the social fabric of communities. I mean, one thing, I live normally in France, and when President Macron announced that the schools were closed back in March, I guess, he, you know, there were television shows, or the news was showing teenagers sort of, yay, you know, celebrating, schools are closed, really excited. And after a couple of weeks, there was a lot less enthusiasm, and they missed their friends, and they missed their teachers, and they missed their school. And so the part of our physicality, the part where we actually like to see people, and actually, you know, it's wonderful that I can do this from Vancouver, but it would be so great to be able to be there with you if you were all together, is something that I think we needed to be reminded of. And so thinking that through of how do we want to balance that is an interesting question. And also, of course, the issue around, okay, supporting the most vulnerable. This is a line. This is, you know, we've got it in all of our policy documents. When we think who are the most vulnerable, COVID sort of created or shone a light on who those were. If we look here, these are the PISA data for access to computers for schoolwork. Belgium is there, not separated by Flemish and French communities, but all of Belgium, and the Netherlands is just, I saw it earlier. Hopefully I'll game for you to play. Hopefully it's there. There is a separation in every single country between disadvantaged schools and advantaged schools. And this is 2018. So if when these data are gathered again, we expect there, despite all the efforts, to be a similar, if not growing, separation. And it's not a mystery, and it's not new, in fact. We know who the most disadvantaged kids are. We know that they are less likely to have computers. We know that they are less likely to have the digital skills. We know that they are less likely to have parents who have the digital skills to help them. And we know that they're less likely to have schools that have computers, that actually have teachers with high level of digital skills and more experienced teachers. So it becomes a perfect storm of disadvantage. And this is, as I said, not new. But I think what COVID has really reminded us is, well, we need to really be serious about solving this issue, because it's not going to go away. And in fact, we would expect that it would get worse. So how are we actually going to do that concretely? And thinking through this sort of virtual face-to-face tension, we think about all the potential powers and possibilities that come with the virtual world. But we also understand that face-to-face, our human face-to-face element is actually incredibly powerful. And one of the things we think about, of course, is whether or not teachers can be effective in virtual environments versus face-to-face. I think there's great evidence that, a great teacher can be very effective in both. And increasingly, you can do a lot more virtually if you really rethink pedagogy and you don't just use it to replace, traditional face-to-face, but you really revolutionize pedagogy. And some of the talks will be on that later. But the other piece, and this is really about the goals of education, is one of the things around education that in face-to-face context is it brings us in contact with people that we don't always necessarily expect. So people not from our neighborhood or from our social group or, from our close friendships. And this is sort of a really traditional role of schools, where it allows students to encounter and experience difference, to meet people who are not like them. And one question is, how can you do that in an increasingly virtual world where you get to choose of all the infinite, selections and opportunities, you can choose where you can go. So like-minded people are put more together, more commonly. So you're less likely to meet somebody who's just very different than you. And that for us is a really open question around, how do we think about this if we think about the future of schooling? In 5 years, 10 years, what is the balance? And by the way, we don't have answers to these questions because the answers sort of depend on your context. But to really think this through and to think through, okay, what do we expect? What do we want to do about the social element of schooling as well as the identity piece? So really thinking through, how do we actually want to build tolerance for difference, for example, if you are less likely to meet people who are very different than you. So also an interesting discussion point. And lastly, just to sort of wrap up with a set of systemic things, there's the capacity piece about training and partnerships. There's the resilience piece. We need and expect that even though the vaccine is coming and we expect to hopefully get out of this sometime in 2021, hopefully sooner rather than later, we know that it's, that shocks are increasingly likely to happen, whether from climate change or whether other pandemics are on the horizon. We actually have seen very clearly the importance of building system resilience. And that means adaptable systems, responsive systems. But how to do this in a time when there's increased pressure to be efficient and to be very careful with budgets, because we're also expecting a severe resource crunch, is not at all clear. And that's the last point here that I wanted to just think about in terms of opportunities or highlight for your discussion, is really thinking about, well, which resources are required, infrastructure, that's, competencies, training, those kinds of things. But we also have to understand that we're expecting a severe economic crunch. So who's making the choices between these kinds of, assuming that we don't have unlimited money, which I think nobody has, who is making the choices and whose voice counts? And how do you actually want to prioritize it? Because this is where it becomes much more difficult to try and get the balance right. If we think about new roles for teachers, they will need new knowledge on instruction, different ways of instructing, not just through hybrid means, but also just through the human emotional element, new ways of assessment, new ways of learning. We also need to think about leadership for change. So we've seen it in action, in fact, but system-wide, how can we create and build and enable and support the profession to sort of, hone this talent, to engage with their colleagues and key partners and collectively lead learning and their profession. We do know, again, from Thales, that the deeper forms of professional collaboration are the strongest, the best for learning, but also the best for satisfaction with teaching. And they are unfortunately not very common. So this is whether or not you can teachers report teaching with another teacher or participating in collaborative professional learning, observing other teachers' classes, etc. Netherlands is just a couple over to the right there. So there's, a real question about how do we want to get the most effective building of the profession, especially in times of economic constraint. And one last sort of warning, I guess, is that, there is a distinction between modernizing, which is incremental processes of improvement, and disrupting, which is a completely different ways of thinking and engagement. And one of the things we've seen, if we look with a very critical eye at the literature and sort of the expectations, is cutting edge technology is often sort of touted as a magic solution. AI is going to revolutionize everything that we're doing, or our jobs, our way of working, our way of living. And thus far, we have not yet seen that transformative element of it as much as you would expect. And in fact, what we have seen is that modernizing, which is not bad, it's incremental improvement, is often called disruption. It's called revolutionize. And so it's very tempting for someone with not much money to choose a path of, we'll find the magic solution and put their money into, for example, supplying devices to everyone. But that isn't a long-term solution, and it doesn't automatically change teaching and learning. And so some of these things really need to be sort of spelled out and thought about and discussed. And I just want to end with, a reminder, the futures thinking piece. This is what we like to do. One of my other hats, the trend shaping education work. We are preparing a new edition, which will come out in January 2026, thinking about the future liking to surprise us and understanding how the impact of change, of trends can vary with how certain or how plausible they are. So for example, climate change, which we would expect to have a huge impact, is pretty certain, in fact, unfortunately. Pandemics, which this is from the 2019 book, this was here before COVID, it's really unclear. It's quite uncertain, but it's not clear what their impact is. What we can say this time for COVID is it had an enormous impact, obviously. Some of the previous ones were not as impactful. So when we think about being surprised and think about being responsive and planning for the future, we have to take into account, trends like increasing inequality. This is from 1985 to 2015. We do expect these trends to increase, unfortunately. This is income inequality, but you can look at it on a number of different dimensions. We do expect, this is a proxy for AI. This is just the number of patents in a 14-year period. We do expect, or a 24-year period, we do expect this, of course, to be exploding, and the potential of AI to revolutionize our way of learning and our way of sort of schooling is immense. This is about virtual freelancing, which is also a proxy for just the digitalization of jobs and the fact that, more people are working more sort of gig jobs in the gig economy. These numbers will continue to rise. But of course, not everything is digital, as I've said. So just one trend about fathers becoming more involved in raising their children. This is the number of OECD countries granting paid paternity leave for over a long period of time, and you see it rising. And this is also interesting to think about when you think about sort of the well-being of children, and what does it mean to grow up in a world and the relationship you have with your father and much more present fathers. So one of the questions we like to think about is sort of how are all these elements outside of education shaping education, and then what does that mean for our planning, our priorities, and our thinking about the future. And our hope is that we are going back to business, but not back to normal, but not in a bad way. So back to business, thinking about smart strategic systems that are prepared, that can cope, that can recover, that are able to evaluate and reflect, and are able to plan and transform what needs to be transformed, but also to keep what works really well and keep that social fabric and the important role that education has to play in our society. So I'll stop there, and thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you, Tracey. I was looking to the right button to unmute myself. So thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. Sorry, I'm looking for the right. Yeah. Okay. We had a vivid discussion going on in the chat, so it's quite difficult to select some questions for you. But I'll try to do that. One of the questions that also struck me was the question: if we are looking now for the short-term solutions to deal with this crisis, and I'm here. I'm having the question here. So and that. The more long-term solutions, robust solutions, are not really thought about at the moment. So, what's your take on this? How can we think about the long-term while also solving pressing issues, for instance, about health, security in the schools, and so on? That's maybe one first question we have for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's an obvious one, and I don't at all want to criticize anyone who is overwhelmed and just doing their best to get through the day. You know, I mean, that's a lot of people are in that circumstance, and particularly at moments, if I understand what Renze was saying about the Netherlands being in lockdown, it's very bad now in Belgium and France. I mean, this is a very difficult moment, and you don't expect people to have extra time to do, you know, futures thinking. The prompt is thinking around two things. The prompt is sort of, if you've already got it in your head, then when you're dealing with the immediate urgencies, you can also start to at least keeping track. Okay, what do I know? What do I see that's working? So you're already evaluating. It's not just sort of trying to cover or put out the fires. The second thing is, of course, that there are moments like during the summer and during the beginning, September, October, where there was a bit more room to breathe. And so it's part of just starting the conversation, part of also thinking about, if I look at Canada as an example, it's a very big country, and there are parts that are extremely stressed right now, and there are other parts that are not. And so not only does the timing differ, but the regions experience it very differently. And you can learn from what's already taken place if you've gone through it first, share with the people who are coming 2 weeks behind you, etc. But you can also, take a breather and start to have that discussion when you have a bit more time. So I do want to be realistic. I understand that it's not, it's a difficult time for everyone. But it's really thinking through what is the best way that we can be agile ourselves. And what we see is just a huge amount of amazing on-the-ground solutions, really, including immediate solutions and thinking 2-5 years in the future. And what we would like to do is capitalize on that and make sure that that can be exchanged systematically so that the systems can really take advantage of that instead of lose it because everybody's sort of too busy to talk, actually.
Okay, thank you. Something that is really important for the participants here is how to deal with students coming from a socially deprived background, not having the facilities to follow online courses. I learned today from colleagues in the chat that also in the Netherlands there are laptops given to students, pupils, but also there are other people saying that it's not enough, of course, and that, for instance, and we know in Flanders that a lot of these youngsters do not have a good internet connection, which means that you cannot do much with one laptop, and also people or youngsters living in a small apartment, 5, 6 other siblings there, having to a lot of noise around. So what can you learn us from OECD perspective? What you gathered from other countries, how to deal with this situation, and so that policy is not only giving laptops to students, but we look at it from a broader perspective. Also, because it's important, because in the Netherlands and Flanders, we do have an issue with equity in education, and maybe it's an opportunity to improve our education systems on that issue, more sustainable in the future. So,
yeah, and there are. I mean, on the one, I guess the bad news is everybody is kind of struggling with the same thing. I would say it's the good news because you can learn, but of course it's bad news because no one has cracked, no system has cracked the puzzle of how do you really help the most disadvantaged to really have the same opportunities as their more advantaged peers. But there's been a lot of really interesting things. So just some concrete examples. One example from the US, which is, a very, very system with a lot of inequality in it, is for very poor inner cities in some of the northeastern states, there's been a way they've equipped school buses with Wi-Fi. And not because they're picking people up, the schools are closed, they're not driving, they're not getting them all on the bus so they can all give each other coronavirus. No, they drive the bus to a park or to a neighborhood where students can come, and it's parked there actually. So it's not just 1 hour. It's a way to actually be able to access Wi-Fi, socially distanced. They put it in a space where you actually have enough space that you can be apart and not actually risk for your health, but they can access this for free, and it's deliberately for educational purposes. And the buses aren't being used because students were not going to school. They had the bus drivers who didn't have anything to do because they weren't driving the bus. They still paid for all the things, so they actually just deployed them differently. I thought that was a really imaginative solution. It allowed students to access internet without needing it to have a home subscription. And it was good quality because it was paid for by the city. Other examples in terms of sharing devices is really, there's been a huge number of programs to just get devices to kids. But as I said, also putting lessons out on the radio or on television if there's really, really a problem with trying to get devices to kids. But of course, that's not a great solution because the quality of the devices might not be very good. And also, if you don't really know what you're doing, then having a device without anybody to help you with it is actually not enough, right? And so the really hard thing there, and one of the interesting things we're seeing is some of the efforts that are made to work with parents, to help the parents understand and help them feel more empowered so that they can help their kids, particularly younger kids who, it's very hard for a 7 or 8 year old to sit in front of a computer all day, or very hard to think about how you might take part in schooling if you're that age and you're at home with 3 other siblings. So really working on the parental piece and trying to help parents, not just with digital skills, but also some of the behavioral and parenting skills if they're at home as well. Those are some of the other interesting things that we've seen that really target the most disadvantaged communities and the most disadvantaged families. But I do think it's the biggest challenge that we have, and we have a long way to go, unfortunately.
It's good you mentioned the parents, because I have a specific question on that. Is that not the biggest disruption, that for the first time ever, the black box of what happens in classrooms, in schools, has broken open, and now parents have seen what happens there, and have had to help their children during the lockdown period, haven't given the lessons, and now, yeah, will be in the future critical partners of teachers and schools more than they were before. Isn't that one of the biggest changes we will see in the near future? That schools, teachers will have to deal with parents more than they ever did before.
Well, I mean, I guess you could frame that positively, saying that they have to partner with parents and they can sort of build on things together. And I think it goes both ways. I mean, one of the really first reactions that we saw in many countries was really a huge appreciation for what teachers are doing. You know, just really understanding, oh, okay, this is not simple. I mean, especially I can barely do it with one child. You have 30. You know, just that sort of like chapeau. Okay, you're a professional, and I'm glad you have those skills because I don't. So that's the sort of positive side of it. The negative side of it is, of course, is that if you're much more involved in the day-to-day lessons, you can be much more critical, and it's easy to criticize in some ways because, you know, you might have particular expertise, or you might have a different way of thinking about it. And I do think actually that will be a real challenge, in the sense that in many systems, the status of teachers has already been threatened. Teachers, if we look at the TALIS survey from previous rounds, teachers report feeling not appreciated. In France, there's worries about violence against teachers. I mean, it's something that has been brewing for a considerable amount of time. And so if that's coupled with a much more parents feeling much more able to advocate and sort of criticize teachers, then I actually think this will be really, really challenging for teachers. And that's something that I haven't yet seen on the agenda. We don't have it on our agenda sort of very specifically yet. And I haven't seen it on the agenda of that many systems. But I do expect it to be a problem also for professionalization and attracting teachers to the profession, because it's, you know, nobody who wants to be in that position. And it's a hard job. It's a tough job. Teachers are there because they love it. But, you know, it's not a guarantee that you would be willing to be criticized all the time and feel unappreciated. So I do think that there could be a very challenging element, not just for the teachers that are in the classrooms, but for attracting and retaining new and young teachers as well.
Yeah, that's maybe as a, yeah, because it's already time. So it was the last question, but maybe it's something to think about also in perspective of OECD future work on how making teachers more resilient to deal with these kind of crises and the changes that it will bring in our education system. So,
yeah, a great suggestion.
Okay, absolutely. We'll discuss that later on in other fora. So, okay, thank you very much, Tracey, for your presentation, for being here while it's already, I think, 1 o'clock in night in Canada. So I think it's a late hour to close working day or to stop working day. So now in a live conference, I would have offered you a coffee, and this is of course not possible. Yeah, we have coffee, but in our homes, of course. So I'll invite you now to all walk in your room, take your coffee on your own, and we see each other and at 10:40. You do not have to log out the hop-in system, so you can stay logged in. And we see each other for the presentation of Professor Melanie Ehren at 10:40.
Thank you very much. Have a good discussion, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Tracey. Bye.
Yeah.